Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. Like usual, before we get into the video, we will talk about updates. So if you haven't heard already, we have started a Patreon. Patreon is a service where you can basically make monthly donations to content creators that you like. So for us, we actually have 5 different tiers. We have a $1 a month tier, which comes with a shout out at the end of each episode, 24-hour early access to each episode, and then a Nick versus video where Nick just rants angrily about stuff. Then there's a $5 a month tier where you get all that previous stuff, and you also get a monthly Q&A with us, video footage of us recording the podcast and unedited episodes, book reviews that we do, which we do both audio ones, and then we also release a transcript with it, so you can have written if you prefer that. And then finally, you get alternate takes. And so that's the $5 a month one. And then the $8 a month is all the previous stuff, of course. And then input on episodes that we do for the podcast, a once a month gaming session with us, and then access to our Discord. So if you're able to give, that would be fantastic. If you can't, we're just happy to have you here. But that is there, just so you all know. Other than that, we just recently dropped our episode about the 1953 coup in Iran. So if you haven't heard that, check it out. Before that, it was our, debut, you could say, for the season, which was our episode about elections where Nick, Cameron, and I each chose an election that we find interesting for, reasons that we talk about. And that's, of course, the second episode we've done like that, because the first one was the first episode of our podcast. So those are out. Check them out if you haven't. And our next episode will be about the Algerian War for Independence. We'll actually be doing a 4-parter on that, so be on the lookout. Anyways, with that being said, we'll get to this week's video. So I wanted to talk about oral history, both because it's, worth knowing about just on its own, but also how it kind of connects to history as a whole. Oral history, if you haven't heard the term before, get your jokes out of the way now, by the way. Oral history is basically a source that has been conducted, through an interview style format of some sort, and then, transcribed or written down or recorded in some way. So oral history has an interesting history itself as a concept, because it actually hasn't always been looked at as a proper source, which to an extent kind of makes sense, because if you're talking to people about certain historical events that they were a part of, the human memory over a long period of time is not always super reliable. So if you are being interviewed about something that happened maybe 20, 30 years ago, or even longer than that, you might not have the clearest recollection of that. And because of that, for a while, actually, a lot of official academic bodies didn't even consider it a legitimate source until recent years. But oral histories do a lot for us as well, even though there are some potential downsides. But any type of source has its own downsides. But one of the main things that oral history does is it allows us to talk to and include people who are usually left out of the historical record. There are people who might be fully illiterate, but there's even people who aren't fully illiterate, but just aren't super comfortable with writing things down and recording things. And so these people get left out of the historical record a lot of the time, or at least they're not very well represented. And so, conducting interviews to just get the words of folks down somewhere as a source is really invaluable, because it rounds out what we have available to consult as sources, and that is a very good thing. Again, especially if, let's say you're in a country, let's say Guatemala, you want to talk to the indigenous folks from the highlands. There's different villages with different cultures and different levels of reading and writing and everything, but let's say you're talking to folks who don't engage in much of that, but you want to make sure you're getting their perspective. If you don't include oral history and you're not really consulting with them, then you're not getting a fully rounded view of history. You're only getting a very, very partial look at what's happening. It can be hard to find sources from them that are, written down. You might use cultural anthropology like artifacts and studies, but you also want to hear people in their own voices too and how they look at things. So that's one reason, and kind of arguably the biggest for general history purposes. But beyond that, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with oral history as well. So one of them is it gives us insights into how people perceive things. So, for example, if you're talking to someone who marched during the civil rights movement, when you're asking them questions and talking to them about everything, you're obviously not just getting the straight facts and recollections, but you're getting how they put it together in their heads, the way they conceptualize it, right? And that can be very useful and also a very good subject of study because it lets you know how people conceive of things. And so some people who marched during the civil rights movement might say, it was amazing. We got everything done that we set out to. It was just this very ideal, amazing moment. Other people you talk to might think that a lot of things were left undone, and to varying degrees. Some might think it's partially complete. Some might think very little was actually done. But talking to people and conducting these interviews is a way to really get that kind of living concept of history and get how people look at things. Another way that it can be interesting is it reminds you of how things used to be in a way that a more static document can. A really easy example of this is when you have maybe a grandparent who tells you about things, before if you have a living great grandparent, maybe it could be someone who talks about what the Great Depression was like or something like that. So you get all these perspectives that, again, you just can't get the same way from more static types of sources. So while oral history, again, like any other source, does have its own pitfalls, there's also really interesting insights into the past that it can offer. Plus, in addition to that, just the more sources you can have, the better. Oral history is very cool. And then if you have that alongside other types of written records and just, any other source you can think of, you put that all together and that's going to give you a good view of the big picture. So thanks for listening this week, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, check out our Patreon if you can, and check out our latest episodes for sure. Have a good week, and thanks for listening.